Lend your ears, lend your hands, lend your movement, anything you can. Come to teach, come to be taught, come in the likeness and the image of God. 'Cause you can be like that, with all that humbleness and all that respect. All of the power.
And I want to introduce you now to a true gentleman. He's a bit of a funny kisser, and he's a bit grumpy first thing in the morning, but he is a true gentleman. Put your hands together, please, for Ian Crane.
Thanks. Well, what an inspirational video to start with, Jason Belfort. Unbelievable. Well, we're going to be talking about the ruling elite, and I think we need to wake up a little bit this morning, so I'm going to kick off with a tribute to the Queen of Australia.
And here with her rendition of a Guns N' Roses classic, take it away, Gina.
Crank it up.
A mo-oh, get in my hole.
I'm talking about a mine.
You're on parole. Do what you do. Dig my big hole
In the ground.
Sweet child, sweet child, love my eyes, mine.
I was only going to play that in Perth, but Mark said, no, don't just do it in Perth, do it everywhere. Everyone hates Gina. Queen Gina. You know, this is my third tour of Australia, and each time I've started in Perth, and with the second time I came back, I wondered if they were actually going to let me in, because I spent most of the time regaling the philosophy of Gina. But, you know, I worked out I'm okay whilst the immigration services of Australia and the US, whilst they use their own databases. I've got a real problem, though, when they start using Google. They might actually find out a little bit more. But this is the epitome of corporatism in Australia. And, in fact, unfortunately, I haven't included it in this presentation, but I have a clip of her father from 1984, Lang Hancock, actually talking about the need to forcibly introduce genocide of the Aborigines, and particularly those who had failed to integrate into the society that the Europeans had brought into Australia. He said, those that have integrated, they're fine, we can leave them alone. But those that haven't integrated, then we need to give them drugs so that basically they become sterile and then they'll just die out. Well, unfortunately, if we think that that philosophy has disappeared, then we actually need to think again. Because what we're going to see, I think, over the weekend is that this philosophy is very much alive and well, and it's actually been extended. If we look at just 9 years ago, the chief executive officer of Nestle, who was a guy called Peter Brabeck, he actually gave an interview, and in that interview, and you can find this online, he gave an interview, and in that interview, he made the observation that, in his opinion, access to fresh water should not be regarded as a human right. And in fact, a judge in the UK made the same observation just 3 days ago. Access to fresh water should not be regarded as a human right. What they're basically saying is that unless you are making a direct contribution to the corporatocracy, then what's your point? What are you doing here? You're just, in the words of Henry Kissinger, you're just a useless eater. And of course, Gina gets a lot of her philosophy from, we've got two old queens together, sharing, and here she is giving Tony his instructions. And of course, what was she getting Tony to do? If we look at the royalties that the mining industry pays to the state government in Western Australia, a lot of those royalties go back to the mining industry to pay for infrastructure. But in reality, the health care bill in Western Australia is 4 times the amount of the royalties that the state government gets from the mining industry. This should be the wealthiest nation on the planet. It should be, because it has the most incredible plethora of natural resources, particularly rare earth minerals. So who thinks that Australia is the wealthiest nation on the planet? One person. Okay, well, let's have a look at this. Let's see if we can get some of this technology to work here. Oh, can we see that? There we go. There's not Gina's bank account. That's the real-time current public debt, i.e. debt owned by governments around the world, running at $54 trillion. But look at the US, look down on the right-hand side of the screen there. The public debt of the US is listed as 14 trillion, and that works out at a public debt per person of $45,000 on a population of nearly 320 million. The UK, not far behind, because per person, the public debt is $41,000. Now, for some reason, we've got Taiwan showing there, and that should be actually Australia. But let's see if we can bring it up as Australia. Maybe somebody's telling me something there. There we go, Australia. So the public debt, this is the debt owned by effectively public office government and state governments. Nearly $400 billion, working out at about just under $17,000. This is in US dollars, $17,000 per person for a population of 23.6 million. 27.3% of GDP. So by definition, Australia is in a lot better shape than the US or the UK. I mean, the US is running at 86% of GDP. The UK is nearly at 100% of GDP. 100%. And basically, once you reach 100% of GDP, or over 100%, that's the point at which effectively the banks own your country and everything in it. So that's exactly the situation that we have in Ireland, in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, and advancing in many other countries. And we'll see why that is in a second. Let's see if we can get this to fly across. This is real time. This is the rate at which debt is cranking up. Debt to GDP. And the bankers are coining it. Absolutely coining it. And we're going to see why that is as we go through here. If we look at the level of private debt for Australia, this is the scary number. This is the really, really scary number. This chart shows that Australia is being set up for a massive collapse. The level of personal debt in Australia is higher than the level of personal debt in the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, any other developed nation. And a big part of this, of course, is the mortgage, because everywhere's got the housing bubble at the moment. And you love that term, mortgage, mortgage, the death grip, the death grip. Now, it was once upon a time, for a lot of the world, the mortgage was the first time that you actually took that first step to actually put the chain around your own neck. Because up until that time, you basically had a degree of freedom. But as soon as you go and sign on the dotted line and get that death grip, you've effectively put the chain around your own neck, the noose around your neck, chains on your ankles, because now you're hooked into the system, and they've got you for 25 years, or whatever it is, the time of the mortgage. Unfortunately, of course, now they're doing it even earlier in a lot of areas with student loans. And in the US, and soon to be the UK, that's why we had massive riots in the UK in this past week, because of course that wasn't reported here, was it? No, it wasn't even reported in the UK. No. Yeah. Compartmentalizing of news. They've learned this from the US. So the news crews come down, film something, or the reporters come down, and it actually gets out about 20 miles. So that everybody in the immediate area who probably heard about it says, oh, it got out on the news. Yeah, it did. Yeah, local news, because it never made it into the next city. That's exactly how things are being compartmentalized. So don't beat yourself up that you don't know anything about the student riots in the UK, because nobody 50 miles outside London knows anything about them either. And the reason that the students were rioting, well, it didn't start as a riot, but of course the police made sure that it turned into one. It started as a protest against the fact that not only were student loans really becoming literally all-consuming, but there was a change in the plan so that you couldn't actually write off the student loan when you become bankrupt, which is the same in the US. So what's happening is the UK is trying to adopt the same practice as in the US. And what we're going to see as we go through the weekend, I'm sure, is that you see more and more things are being harmonized. It's an unfortunate term, harmonized. You take the lowest common denominator and you apply that on a global basis. How many people here have heard of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership? Okay. How many people think that's a really good thing? Funny that, isn't it? Because on the other side of the world, of course, we have the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And here we are in the building, and we're walking through this building from the car park. I said to Mark, I thought we were talking in a conference centre, not an airport. I don't think I've ever walked quite so far from a parking lot to a room. But as we're walking through, Mark said, gosh, you can almost feel the sleaze and the corruption just oozing out of the walls. So maybe we're here for a reason. Maybe we're here to try and bring a bit of energetic balance to this place. But here we've had people literally talking about how they can continue to screw the global population. And the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership are complete misnomers, because basically what it is, it's global governance by stealth. Because the whole purpose of these agreements is to establish a raft of corporate legislation that sits above all national legislation. So, for example, I know Paul is going to be talking about the tremendous achievements at Bentley in running off Magasco there. But Magasco now are simply waiting for TPP to kick into place so that they can then sue the New South Wales and federal government for loss of revenue. Yeah, we laugh because it's so outrageous, it can never happen. But it is, it's coming down the tracks at a phenomenal rate of knots. Now, we've got a general election coming up in the UK, and fortunately, an increasing number of people are trying to make sure that the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, is very much on the table in the run-up to that election. But it's something that we have to absolutely acknowledge. Because if we don't, then in a very short space of time, then state and national laws won't actually matter a damn. Because we will all be effectively subjugated to this raft of corporate legislation. And the purpose of this is actually to sort of strip the last remaining wealth out of nations and out of individuals and get them into the hands of a few people who run this globalist corporatocracy. Now, I want to show a short animation. And in this animation, it's looking at the distribution of wealth across the planet. Now, I don't have time to show them for other countries, but let me assure you that what you're going to see on a global basis is pretty much mirrored on a national basis. Now, when you think that Gina, for example, her wealth is greater than the combined wealth of the next 3 wealthiest Australians. And of course, Gina is determined to make sure that she increases her wealth to whatever it is that she can get it to. Of course, her kids are trying to get some of that back, but she's basically saying, you're not having anything. What a great parent. You're not having nothing. Anyway, have a look at this, and have a look at, in particular, at the amount of wealth that is owned by such a few people at the top of this pyramid.
People are talking a lot about inequality these days, about the fact that the richest 1% have so much more than everybody else. But most of the focus seems to be on the United States. And it strikes me that the same story needs to be told about global inequality too. So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the UN. It turns out that while the US is totally out of whack, things are actually way worse for the planet as a whole. Let's start with this graph. A perfectly even distribution of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the chart. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US, and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries, on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop, but who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules.
Change the rules. So who's going to change the rules? Well, this is a mural. This is a mural that appeared on a wall in the East End of London about 3 years ago or so now. And in fact, whilst the guy was painting it, he was getting a lot of abuse and eggs were being thrown at the wall because people thought that it was actually a sort of promo for the Illuminati or something. So he had to add this quickly on the side so that people could see which side of the fence he was actually sitting on. Now, this isn't the finished product. And I'll show you the finished product in a second because the finished product is actually remarkably insightful. Now, what we see here, of course, is the separated capstone of the Great Pyramid. And this is the Great Seal that appears on the back of the $1 bill. The US $1 bill, that is, not the Australian one. In fact, you don't have one, do you? It's the separated capstone is very important in the belief system of those who think they are the rightful rulers of a global corporatist fiefdom. What this represents is the knowledge and the wisdom of the few, never to be shared with the masses under pain of death. And this is a belief system that is so far removed from anything that's out in orthodoxy that even if most people do stumble across it, then they go, no, that can't be right. That can't be true. Because we're literally treated like mushrooms, fed shit and kept in the dark. The lower part of the pyramid obviously represents the masses. And those who think they are the rightful rulers. And unfortunately, I don't have the time this weekend to go into the detail of that. But I'll maybe touch on it a bit later, and I have got some DVD, I think, with that story on it. But those who think they are the rightful rulers are determined to literally take control of everything. But there's an interesting twist to this. Because they're coming into the final round of the game, but they actually have to tell us in their belief system, they have to tell us what it is they're going to do. And they do this. And the reason they do this is so that nobody can ever throw back at them, well, you didn't tell us, we didn't get an opportunity to participate in the decision. Yes, we did. Yes, we did. It doesn't necessarily mean to say that it's on the front pages of the national newspapers or broadcast on the national news, but it's out there. It's out there. Mark made the observation at the start of the conference that, we shouldn't necessarily take everything that's presented at face value, and absolutely, I endorse that. I certainly don't expect or want anyone to take anything that I say at face value. The purpose of what I do is to try and stimulate people's curiosity so that they will take a look at this for themselves. And the reason it's so important that we have people looking at this is because the more people that we've got looking at this, the more we're able to uncover the details of their scripts and their agenda. So we actually have the blueprints available to us, and I'm going to share some of those with you as we go through. So it's very important to them that they put this information out there, because ultimately our lack of reaction is taken as our acquiescence that gives them a mandate then to pursue their agenda. And the beauty of these conferences is that we bring together people who are looking at different aspects of this, because no one person, no small group of people can look at everything. It's a multi-pronged, multifaceted attack on humanity. It's a bio-spiritual warfare. And today I'm going to focus very much on what's going on in the physical, empirical, material realm. And then tomorrow in the afternoon, I'm going to focus much more on how it is that they're trying to keep us locked into this physical, empirical, material realm and shut down our capacity to access the non-physical. Because they know that if we reach our full potential and our full realization of what's occurring, then they're not going to be able to hold on to their dominion. But right now, they absolutely have the advantage. They have the advantage. They're holding all the aces. That doesn't mean to say it's game over, though, by a long stretch. You know, all through history, people have tried to share their insights. Of course, up until fairly recently, that normally meant that they came to a pretty sticky end because they were challenging orthodoxy directly. And so it either meant that they ended up in jail or, of course, ended up in their death. But through the 20th century, as the global corporatists have tried to establish their absolute dominion, and it really started in 1913, in fact on December 21st, 1913, with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in North America. This is the third time that the banksters had tried to establish total control of the US economy, i.e. the issuance of currency. The third time. The reason it got shut down the previous two was because senators realized what the banksters were trying to do and they shut it down. But in 1913, they were able to do it. And J.P. Morgan, who was one of the driving forces behind this, coincidentally provided all of the opponents in the Senate, which was a small group of very powerful senators, the opponents to the establishment of the Federal Reserve, and coincidentally, they were all given free passage on the flagship of the White Star Line, the Titanic. The Titanic. So conveniently, the bulk of the opposition went to the bottom of the ocean, and shortly afterwards, the banksters were able to force through the Federal Reserve Act on December 21st, 1913. Woodrow Wilson was the president of the US at the time, and he made this observation in his memoirs. He said, "We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of small groups of dominant men." This is a cartoon that appeared in the US press in the run-up to the Federal Reserve Act being passed into law. And this is because the people who knew how the banksters operated could see what was going to occur. Once you gave the private banksters the opportunity to establish their control of the economy, then it wouldn't take them long to effectively get their tentacles around everything. By the way, even the changes that occurred in the early part of the 20th century, where participation in the political process was opened out to the masses, you see, that was a deliberate decision because that worked in the favor of those who think they're the rightful rulers. Because up until around about, certainly in the period between 1910 and 1920, governments of the US and Canada and the UK, I'm not sure about Australia, but to participate in government, you had to be a person, a man, of independent means. You had to have sufficient wealth. You had to demonstrate that you had the financial resources to sustain yourself to be in public office. In other words, you had to be able to demonstrate that you were unlikely to be susceptible to bribery and corruption, which actually doesn't work very well for those who think they're the rightful rulers. So they needed people to come into Parliament, to come into public office, who would be more susceptible to the old brown envelopes. So they opened the opportunity to go into political office to the masses. And unfortunately, what we see today, right across the planet, is levels of corruption that, 100 years ago would have been unthinkable because people went into public office for the right reasons. Here is another cartoon. It was that appeared shortly after the establishment of the Federal Reserve. The Rothschilds, for billions a year as interest on bonds, I rent the human race the privilege of existing on my earth. Through the private central bank scheme, I'll soon grab the United States. Then I'll own all Christendom. Tsars, emperors, kings, and the people all must obey my orders, submit to my exactions, or get off my earth. Which is, of course, basically what they've been doing for the last 100 years. But, of course, you twist it, you spin it. And the connection that few people make is that all of the countries that have been targeted as the axis of evil all had one thing in common. They had economies that were operating outside of the central banking system. So you whip up this fervour of hate in your populations to get the mandate to send the private militia of the global banksters into these countries to effectively take control of their resources and establish a central bank. You know, for Libya, and the reason that Libya was targeted, I mean, bear in mind Gaddafi had been in power there for 40 plus years. But if you look at what Gaddafi brought to the people, you know, free education, people who had the capacity and capability to go into tertiary education in the Western world, it was financed by the state. When people got married, they got provided with the finance to either buy or build a house. If people wanted to start a business, then they presented their business plan to the Libyan bank, which was a bank of the Libyan people. And if the people in the bank thought it was a good business plan, then they would provide them, you know, with the funding, and it would be a partnership. And if the business failed, then they took their responsibility for that business failing. They didn't drive the person into bankruptcy. You know, there is so much about the socialistic approach of Libya that it would be the envy of people in the Western world if they actually knew what was going on. But the real reason that Gaddafi was targeted, of course, was because Gaddafi had this vision of establishing an Arab-African economy based on gold, which would bring about the destruction of the petrodollar. He also introduced a scheme to try to push back the Sahara Desert. So he was bringing water up from the great underground aquifers, which actually some believe put the Great Artesian Basin into the shade. And he was bringing this water up and piping it across the northern edge of the Sahara Desert to push the desert back. And it was piped across the northern edge in a 7-foot concrete conduit. After the attack on Libya was initiated, the French actually bombed the factory. Sorry, on the second day, they bombed the conduit. They bombed the concrete conduit. And on the following day, they bombed the factory that built the concrete conduit. So this is a war crime. And the Rothschilds had established a central bank with the rebels even before Gaddafi was overthrown. You know, what is going on with Libya, with Iraq, and now, of course, with Syria, is the global corporatists mopping up the last remaining independent states that were operating outside of their control. So what do we have left? Cuba, North Korea, and of course the ultimate goal, Iran. You see what's happening? It's all scripted. How many people here have heard of the group called Pinic, the Project for a New American Century? Okay, a very, very few of you. There is a document that was published. This is freely available. You download it from the Pinic website. It's P-N-A-C. Just Google Pinic. The document is called Rebuilding America's Defenses. It actually has nothing to do with America, really. It's about establishing this globalist control agenda. This document was published in September of 2000, and it's basically the blueprint of everything that has been happening for the last 14 years. And when you read it, you think, oh my God, I mean, this is like George Orwell on acid. Until you turn to the back page, and you see that there's 26 people have put their signatures to this document, and 13 of them went straight in to George W. Bush's government after he was sworn in on the White House lawn in January of 2001. It's all there. The script is there. Yeah, and there's been a number of people that have been trying to raise awareness of this document and say, look, the script is there. And people go, no, that's just a conspiracy theory. This is the guy who has been driving this agenda. This is the guy who was tasked with bringing about the global financial collapse. And of course, he was able to do this. Really, the whole process was kicked off in 1998 when Bill Clinton actually repealed the Glass-Steagall Act in the US. The Glass-Steagall Act had been in place since 1933, and basically was in place to prevent the banks from literally putting too much money into the economy. Putting too much debt into the economy. So it restricted the amount of debt that they could create. And the idea being, obviously, to avoid the great crash of '29 again. But Clinton repealed that legislation in 1998, so that it literally opened the floodgates. And it really kicked off, obviously, after George W. Bush came into office in 2001, and we had 9/11, we had a whole lot of other events that kept people blindsided. This guy was telling the banks, get the money out there, get as much into the global economy as you possibly can. Let's build up these debts to the point where there is absolutely no alternative except collapse. And look at the guy's rewards. I mean, I've just picked up on his income from 2007 through 2013. So this guy in that period has earned the grand total of $215 million US. As you can see, he had a bad year in 2008. That must have been real tough. But of course it wasn't. What happened was that was the year at which the GFC became very apparent to everybody, and it wouldn't have looked too good if Lloyd Blankfein had actually sort of picked up another $30 million whilst he'd been overseeing this collapse. So you can see that he had a pretty significant increase in his income the following year. Well, much of that is deferred income from the previous years. Deferred income. He had done exactly what he was tasked to do. And it's exactly the same as any incentive compensation scheme, based on actual results. And he achieved those results. What you see there, the graphic, is actually the front cover of the Sunday Times magazine from 2008, late 2008. And in that article, he actually talks about doing God's work, how he believes he's doing God's work. I mean, where have you heard this before? George Bush, Tony Blair. They all think they're doing God's work. Well, there ain't no God of yours or mine. And in that article, he actually boasts and brags about how they treat their people. And of course, ever since the mid-90s, again, it's all been out there in the corporate vocabulary, human resources. We got anybody here who works in human resources? And you're going to admit it? Human resources. I mean, that tells you what we are to the global corporatists. You're a commodity to be used, abused, and spat out when you're finished with. In the UK right now, we have this abomination called 0 hours contracts. 0 hours contracts. Basically, it's where the company says, yeah, we'd like to employ you when we need you, but we're not going to guarantee you any income, and we're certainly not going to guarantee you any benefits. So consequently, people go out and they get sort of 3 or 4 0 hours contracts. And then you get 2 of the companies phoning you up, wanting you on the same day, and you say, well, okay, I'll go this one. And the other one says, what, you're not coming in? Okay, you're fired from a 0 hours contract. And yet this is considered to be acceptable. Gone are the days when corporations felt that they had any kind of social responsibility. There is only one responsibility today, and that is what is euphemistically called shareholder value. Shareholder value. In other words, it's pumping up the stock price of the company to the highest possible level at all costs. And if you can commit fraud and maybe get away with it for a while, at least for the duration of your tenancy of CEO, then that's completely acceptable too, which is what's been going on with Tesco in the UK. But it's rife, which is why the stock market is also on the brink of a collapse as all these frauds come home to roost. So who is this God? Well, this is the God that I think it's actually gold, oil, and diamonds, which would be the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the Oppenheimers, controlling the resource. Or it should be gold, oil, and drugs, but drugs are the CIA. What we've got is now we've got about 147 companies effectively controlling the global corporatocracy, and that's reducing all the time as, of course, the larger companies push their competitors into a position where they become susceptible to takeover. This is a banner from the Occupy protests of, what is it now, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. You know, capitalism isn't working because we don't have capitalism anymore. What we have is corporatism. I mean, I'm a capitalist. I believe in benign capitalism. You know, I believe in the companies actually taking responsibility for the role that they play in society. I'm not a capitalist who believes in permanent growth. The only reason we have to have permanent growth is to fuel the interest on the debt that's being created. Has anybody ever played this game before? Yeah, anybody played Monopoly? Has anybody ever finished a game of Monopoly? Okay. Keep your hands up if you finished a game of Monopoly. Okay. Keep your hand up if you won. Okay. Keep your hand up if you were the banker. You know, if you actually finish a game of Monopoly, I mean, that's if you manage to get through sort of 3-4 days of playing, then ultimately, you go for the jugular of your opponents, right? You know, the game goes through certain stages. Initially, you've got to buy up these properties on the board. And then there's got to be a degree of cooperation because you can't start building hotels or houses on these properties until such time as you've got a complete set. So you've got to barter and negotiate with your opponents, your fellow players. And then once you've got a complete set, then you can start building your houses and your hotels. And once you've got your houses and hotels up there, that's the point at which the real game starts. Because from that point forward, there's only one objective, and that's total ownership of the board. And the reason, of course, that the banker always seems to do pretty well in the game is because, you know, the banker's responsible for issuing the currency. And so if the banker's running a bit light on funds, you know, when the banker goes past go, he might slip himself an extra 200. Or just slip a couple more hundred, you know, when no one's looking. Just like the real world. Except in the modern game, it's now done with a credit card. And the only way, unless you're maintaining a ledger or a spreadsheet as you go through the game, the only way you can find out how much credit you got is to keep giving the card to the banker who puts it in the machine and it reads out, you know, what your balance is. So we're conditioning the kids. I mean, the game was all about conditioning right from the get-go. But now we're conditioning the next generation to play the game in a cashless mode. And now they've introduced another version, not just based on a city like London or New York. Now you can go for the world, which is, of course, exactly what they're doing. And that mural that was being painted on this wall in Brick Lane, this is the finished product. It is the bankers playing their game for total control on the backs of the people. You know, how many people here understand the process of fractional reserve banking? Okay, a few hesitant hands going up. Okay, now be honest. How many people understood the process of fractional reserve banking 10 years ago? Okay, a very, very small number of people. Okay, so one of the benefits of what's happened with the GFC is that an increasing number of people have educated themselves as to how the banking system works. So for those of you who know how the system works, you can shut your eyes for a few minutes, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief explanation, and it's a very simplistic explanation, I do accept that, but nonetheless it's fundamentally correct as to how the fractional reserve banking system works. And you can see from this how it is that the banks are effectively taking control of every facet of our economies. So the thing about fractional reserve banking is it's almost like alchemical. You know, it's literally, in fact, it's even more magic than alchemy, because with alchemy, at least you need a base material, whether it's lead into gold or whether it's the personal transformation, but you need to start with something. But with fractional reserve banking, you don't actually need to start with anything at all. All you need is a mandate from the government that gives you the opportunity to control the issuance of currency, to control the economy. So, for example, when the US Federal Reserve was established, they weren't going to use their own money, if they had any. So what they decided to do was they literally created money out of nothing on a ledger and loaned it to the American government. The American government didn't need all that money straight away, so they deposited it with the Federal Reserve. And then, right from the get-go, the banksters are charging the US government interest on that loan. So that was the seed capital for the Federal Reserve. Now, in this example, we're going to say, okay, we'll start with $1 million here. But we're going to use a multiplier to turn that 1 million into 5 million. Nothing more than a multiplier. A simple calculation of we're going to multiply that by 5 to give us 5 million to start pumping out into the economy. But even with 5 million, we can't really do very much, and it's a bit of a big task to do it on our own, so we need other banks in the equation. So we're going to create 5 banks here, and we're going to start pumping that 5 million down into the other banks by giving them $1 million each. But the other banks are going to use a fractional reserve ratio of 10 to 1. So they're going to multiply this 1 million that they've got, which of course didn't exist in the first place, but they've now got 1 million, and they're going to multiply it by 10, so they're going to have 10 million to start playing with. And so we're going to push this down, and then we have banks lending to banks, charging each other interest, and some of you may have heard about the LIBOR scandal, which is the bank into lending rate, where they were manipulating the interest rates that they were charging each other, which goes into, it's like, all going in multiple directions. But what you've got here, what we've created at the bottom end here, is potentially 70 million, just in the banks along the bottom here, 70 million to start pumping out into the economy through things like personal loans, mortgages, loans to businesses. And of course, everything that we pump out there has to be paid back. But it has to be paid back with interest. So what people don't realize is that 97% of all this stuff that is floating around in the economy, 97% of it, somebody somewhere owes interest on it. And it's all going one way. It's going to the banks. So that's what keeps us on the treadmill. Whether it's the personal loan, whether it's the student loan, the mortgage, it keeps us locked in to their version of life. Actually, it's not life, is it? It's an existence. It's an existence. It's a routine. When I was doing a project in London about 20 years ago, and I rented a house about half an hour south of the city centre, and I used to get the train, and although I wasn't necessarily tied to a schedule, but I got into a routine, and I used to get this 7:21 train from Epsom into London every day. And I noticed there was this guy, and he'd come along with his umbrella and his briefcase, and he would walk along to the platform, and he would stand like this. And the train started at Epsom, so the train used to come in, and the doors used to be exactly where he was standing. And then as the doors opened, he would get in, and he would go straight to his seat and sit down and open his paper. Well, I watched this for a few days, and then the devil sort of, as it was, got inside me. And I waited at the next door. And as the doors opened, I jumped in and jumped into his seat. And he was standing there. I'm sitting down there, I've opened the paper. And he's standing over me, looking like this. And I looked up and went, yes. He said, my seat! And I realized that what I did in the next few nanoseconds was going to determine what sort of day he had. So in that time, I thought, no, okay. So I said, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was reserved. And just moved across. And then he sat down, and he opened the paper. And he turned to me and he said, 32 years. 32 years I've been doing this journey, and I always sit in this seat. And I felt like saying, you sad motherfucker. But it was one of those occasions when, the mouth actually said something completely different. So I said, oh really? I said, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to take your seat. But it's an existence. I felt like saying, what do you do? What actually you get? Where do you get your excitement from? Yeah? But this is the way in which we're structured. He probably had a big mortgage. Maybe had a second home. Maybe had kids in private school. Everything about keeping him locked into the system. It's brilliant. Take nothing away. So once you're putting money into the system, obviously it's got to come back from somewhere. And that's basically what's happening now, is that nations are having to sell off their assets to pay back the interest on the loans. I mean, in the UK alone now, the interest is over £100 billion sterling a year. That's the interest, let alone the payment. So what's happening is the actual debt itself is ramping up. And that's why it's now literally just under 100% of GDP. And when it gets to that point here, which is that's the 100% GDP, that's the point of no return. That's when these guys literally own your country. I'll give you an example of a country that came really close to being in hock to the bankers, but actually just managed to get off with a little bit of help from a neighbour by the seat of their pants. Anyone seen this before? Yeah? The Palm Islands in Dubai. Well, I lived in Dubai between 1990 and 94. And Sheikh Mohammed Al Maktoum was a very benevolent despot. A benevolent despot, a dictator. But he was using the oil revenues from Dubai to try to provide a long-term plan for the people of the country. And he was putting a lot of money back into the economy. And he was doing it all on the basis of he would only spend money that he was generating through oil production. But when he died, his son came into office, and the banksters came along and said, hey, sorry to hear about your dad. Your dad was a great man. He was a visionary. But we know that you're an even bigger visionary. And we've got a plan, a proposition to put to you that would enable you to put Dubai not only on the world map, but actually you could see it from outer space. And of course, there was another part of this, a set of islands that were in the shape of the map of the world. I think Paul will talk about them a little bit later. But these islands were finished, and all these high-dollar properties were built around these islands, and there were sort of 7-star hotels built here to attract the high-dollar tourists. And just as the project was finished, the GFC kicks in. So all of a sudden, the high rollers just weren't coming to Dubai, and they certainly weren't interested in spending large sums of money on these properties. But he had to start paying for it. And the banksters came along and said, hey, Sheikh, it's time to start giving us a little bit of payment. And he went, well, it's a bit of a problem right now because, I know we got the project, but, we've got this global financial collapse. People aren't coming here. And the bankster said, well, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? What are we going to do? Oh, I know. You've got oil. How about we simply take control of your oil futures? And I think at that point, he discovered he had some new muscles. Well, he got lucky because his neighbor, Sheikh Zayed, in Abu Dhabi, came to his rescue because the Zayed family had nearly been shafted, well, they were shafted by the British, funnily enough. You know why it was always said that the sun never set on the old British Empire? Britain owned so much of the globe. So the sun never set on the British Empire. That's because God didn't trust the British in the dark. I don't blame him. I don't blame him at all. So the British shafted Sheikh Zayed with the deliberate collapse of the BCCI Bank. And he took personal responsibility. And he said that he would make sure that everybody who lost would eventually receive some element of retribution for that. But Zayed stepped in and helped address this issue that the Maktoums had with the World Bank. So Sheikh Zayed, I think it was, it's a very big number, it's something about 300 billion or something, $300 billion US dollar. But that's how close Dubai came to being in hock to the World Bank. The people who work in Goldman Sachs know that the whole thing is toxic. And, fortunately, there are a few whistleblowers now. This is an article from the Daily Mail a couple of years ago. And just an extract here. This guy said, what's more, Goldman clients understand that the firm's bankers are traders and getting rich quick. As one Goldman employee says, money is the way you define your success. You always keep score. There's always room for more. If you are not bringing in more cash, getting a bigger bonus, buying a bigger house or a bigger boat, you're falling behind. It's an addiction. So, this is the abject evidence that the Wolf of Wall Street mentality is still very much alive and well. And of course, they're getting more and more greedy because they're approaching the countries and saying, okay, so you can't pay us, what have you got? So basically everything is being sold. And if you don't sell it, then the US military, which isn't the US military, it's the private militia of the global corporatists. And, interestingly, the young American men are starting to realize that a career in the US military is not conducive with life expectancy. If the bogeyman doesn't get you, then the drugs that they give you will, because the suicide rate amongst ex-US servicemen is so high, it's actually causing more fatalities now than the actual theaters that these guys are operating in. Because the withdrawal of these drugs, unfortunately, enables these poor men to experience or relive what it is that they were perpetrating whilst they were under the influence of the drugs. So when they were actually on the front line, they weren't themselves. They were operating in a different reality. And the terminology that's being used now in the military is dehumanizing the whole game. Do you know what those drone operators, the drone operators, these are the 18-year-old and 19-year-old kids sitting in, a bunker somewhere in Arizona or on one of the air bases in the UK, and they're flying these drones and then sort of bombing. Do you know what they call a civilian death when, unfortunately, they get the wrong target? They call it a bug splat. A bug splat. The whole point being, it's the neuro-linguistic programming to effectively take away the impact of killing another human. So use the terminology of bug splat. Do you know what the Israelis called the recent attack on the West Bank, on Gaza? Do you know what they called it? Mowing the lawn. Mowing the lawn. This is the mentality that we're dealing with. It's not human as we understand humanity. Two of the fundamentals of humanity are love and compassion. And these guys who are perpetrating this agenda have neither. And of course, what they're trying to do is to create an environment where the people that are doing their dirty work adopt effectively the same mentality. This is a graphic. It's a very, very significant graphic. It's a graphic that appeared in 3 languages, in France, in the Netherlands, and in Ireland, in the run-up to ballots as to whether or not the people of those countries wanted to remain within the European Union. Obviously, this is the one that appeared in Ireland. In France and the Netherlands, the vote was to effectively get out of the European Union, but their government said, well, thanks for letting us know what you think. But not really interested. So consequently, they remained in the European Union. In Ireland, their constitution required that they had a ballot. And of course, they didn't get the right response the first time, so they had to have another one. And this is the poster that appeared on pretty much every bus shelter and all over the country in the run-up to the second election. Now, there's a lot of imagery contained within this. I mean, not least the stars around the top. This is the geometry of Baphomet. Can you cast your mind to the old posters that the Americans used in the First World War? Uncle Sam, your country needs you. Well, the depiction of Uncle Sam was using this geometry. It's the geometry of Baphomet. So what do we have here? What does this represent? Anybody awake? Tower of Babel, yes. How do we know that's the Tower of Babel? Was anybody around at the time of the Tower of Babel? I'm going to touch on this a little bit more tomorrow, but this is, by the way, a classic illustration of how our worldview is constructed for us. Because the reason that we perceive that to be the Tower of Babel is because of this. Of Bruegel's artwork, his depiction of the Tower of Babel. And so that has become our adopted worldview in terms of what the Tower of Babel looks like. And we'll look at some other examples of this because, it can be quite interesting. It can actually be very challenging if we sit down and go through the process of epistemological integrity and actually start to ask ourselves how much of our worldview is based on personal experience and how much is effectively the construct that has been fed to us through education, through the media, etc. So the Tower of Babel. Well, if anybody was in any doubt that the EU is a Babylonian entity, then look no further than the parliamentary building in Strasbourg, which effectively uses, obviously the architects were getting a bit lazy, and so they said, let's just copy this. And by the way, the BBC building in the centre of London, is less obvious, but nonetheless still using the same principle of this Bruegel artwork. But back to this. What the Tower of Babel represents here is the same as the separated capstone. In other words, the Tower of Babel in this is representing the knowledge and the wisdom of the few, never to be shared with the masses. The moat represents that separation, the separation between capstone and the rest of the pyramid. We see the two guys in the grey suits standing, looking longingly across at the Tower of Babel. Longingly there. What does that represent? Those grey suits represent anybody whose name that you know in the public domain. Because they're not part of the inner sanctum. And they're looking longingly across saying, what have we got to do? What have we got to do? I've done everything that they asked. I've sold my grandmother. I've sold the souls of all my family. And my own soul. I've committed my soul for the next multiple lifetimes. What's it going to take for me to get inside? They'll never get inside. In fact, it's my opinion that those who think they are the rightful rulers actually despise these people. There's no polite word in the English language to describe these people, but there is a word in German. It's Kampfpolizei, which was shortened to capo. This is the people who were designated to run the ghettos in Nazi Germany. So the Nazis didn't want to use their own human resources to run the ghettos. So having herded the Jewish communities into the ghettos, they then appointed people of the Jewish community to run those ghettos. And those people got better food, better housing, better clothing. But of course, they were also responsible for providing the lists of who was going to be shipped out to the camps. But once the ghetto had been emptied, what happened to them? They were on the next truck out. And that's what's going to happen to these people. They're on the next truck out. Now, this is the depiction of humanity. The people, the proletariat, the hoi polloi. But do you notice something about the way in which they are depicted? Lego, yeah. They're blockheads. Blockheads. Everyone there is a blockhead except one. Can you see the exception? It's the baby. The baby. This is the recognition that they know that every human life form that enters into this physical arena enters with the potential to access the full range of their human capacity. But the challenge The challenge that these guys have is to make sure that they never achieve that. To make sure that by the time they get to young adulthood, they are completely enslaved to the system. They are completely dumbed down. And as many of the speakers through the weekend are going to be discussing, this is becoming so obvious. It's becoming so apparent that we actually almost can't deny it, and we can't understand how other people can deny it. But yet, we are still very much in the minority. But that critical mass is perhaps coming much quicker than the establishment care for, which is why they're trying to put so much pressure now and labeling those who challenge orthodoxy as non-violent domestic extremists. Non-violent domestic extremists. David Rockefeller said, "We are on the verge of global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order." And how often do we see people say, "You still believe in a new world order? You must be a conspiracy theorist." Yet before Gordon Brown took the role of Prime Minister in the UK, he actually gave a speech in which he mentioned the phrase New World Order no less than 17 times. And basically what he was saying, I'm your boy, I'm your bitch. Let me have the job of Prime Minister and I'll do whatever it is that you want me to do. Unfortunately, when he got the job, I think he realized just, how much of his soul he'd mortgaged in return for occupying number 10 Downing Street for a brief while. Woodrow Wilson said some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something. They know that there is a power so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they'd better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. The fear porn is being ramped up as the distraction. To try and break this trend of an increasing number of people beginning to realize that something ain't right. And of course, this fear porn has been ramped up in a big way. This was the first person to suffer the fate of beheading after 9/11 in 2002. And he was allegedly beheaded by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the guy who admitted to being the mastermind behind 9/11. But only after being waterboarded 183 times. If you waterboard me once, I'll admit to being Jack the Ripper, Sweeney Todd, and anybody else you want me to admit to. Waterboarding is not a pleasant experience by any stretch of the imagination. So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, yes, he admitted to, but of course we have a guy called Omar Sheikh, who is actually serving a life sentence, because he also admitted to being the perpetrator of the beheading. Then more recently, we had Nicholas Berg in 2004, and then literally coming right up to the last few weeks, I'm sure you've seen this in the Australian press, yes? Yeah? Have you seen the videos? Yeah? Well, it's actually illegal to download the videos in the UK, and the reason that David Cameron made it illegal was because he doesn't want people to see how badly produced they are. Because these are all green screen videos. And, basically the British security services are desperately searching for Jihadi John. Well, they just need to go to West London around Pinewood Studios, where these videos are being made, and they'll find him. It's always Jihadi John. This guy with a South London accent that is perpetrating, and this is the latest one last weekend, Peter Kasich, it's always Jihadi John. It's always the same green screen backdrop. But something is happening here. Basically, this is about creating the fear. It's about trying to shut down the debate about the legitimacy of, allegedly, the attacks on ISIS. You know what ISIS stands for, don't you? Israeli State Intelligence Services. Ask yourselves this. We've got, allegedly, an Islamic terrorist group that is driving brand new Toyotas, wearing brand new Nikes, got the latest hardware, rocket-propelled grenade launchers. Am I missing something? Because I'd love to bring the British government down. Which fucking Amazon or eBay page do I have to go to order this stuff? Because these guys do. They seem to just be able to go on the page and order whatever they want. And they have the funding for it. I can't even afford a pea shooter. Something's not right here. And if it's Islamic State, why aren't they turning on Israel? Why aren't they using these resources to turn on the state of Israel, which is perpetrating the genocide on the Palestinians? And if anybody thinks that the Israelis are going to stop until they have nailed the last Palestinian, then they've got another thing coming. And if you want to check that out, then read the book of Ilan Pappé. He's a Jewish historian, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And what I've just said is actually a quote from Ilan Pappé. The Israelis are not going to stop. And what ISIS is doing is not only getting rid of Assad, which is one of the last remaining non-Rothschild banks in the area, but they're actually creating the opportunity ultimately to establish the state of Greater Israel, everything between the Nile and the Euphrates. Meanwhile, they're presented as this great fear. And, we can expect to see beheadings on the streets of London or the streets of Sydney. Bullshit. Something else might be going on here. This is the Masonic apron of the 9th to 11th degrees of an Arabic Masonic order known as Memphis Mitzrayim. And let me just share with you what Ben Schnobelen, who's a writer on Freemasonry, has to say. He says Memphis Mitzrayim is a little-known Masonic group based upon Arabic and Egyptian magic. As such, they are deeply satanic and very powerful throughout the Middle East. Any Arab Mason who dares to disobey the edict of the top commander of Memphis Mitzrayim stands in dire danger of death. This group is very powerful and feared. However, their top commander is controlled by the top leadership of international Illuminized Freemasonry. It's all part of the same agenda. And how is that going to impact us? Well, let me tell you how it's going to impact you guys. The technology will come on.
Incredibly, for some time to come, Australians will have to endure more security than we're used to and more inconvenience than we'd like. Regrettably, for some time to come, the delicate balance between freedom and security may have to shift. There may be more restrictions on some so that there can be more protection for others. After all, Madam Speaker, the most basic freedom of all is the freedom to walk the streets unharmed and to sleep safe in our beds at night. So, Madam Speaker, creating new offences that are harder to beat on a technicality may be a small price to pay for saving lives and for maintaining the social fabric of an open, free and multicultural nation.
So you feel safer? Well, don't feel as though you're being singled out, because they're using different terminology. Of course, Queensland is on point here with the bikie laws. But it's the same the world over. It's the same in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand, and in the UK. It's all about trying to create this fear so that we can shut down the non-violent domestic extremists who have the audacity to challenge the veracity of this version of reality. Tony Abbot says that he needs to shut down freedoms to protect people from terror. Well, this is the breakdown of deaths in Australia between 2003 and 2012, and the suicide one is massive. Massive. And again, it's the same we see in the other countries. And a big part of this is young people. Young people. First of all, it's the pushing of drugs. I'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow. The pushing of drugs like Ritalin amongst the young people. And then people coming out of either the military or out of education and not able to find any kind of work. And as Mark said, I certainly made the observation because I've stayed in Sydney for a week plus each time I've been to Australia, and this time round, the level of homelessness, the begging on the streets, is much greater than I remember from even just 2 years ago. So suicide, top of the list. But look at terrorism, it's 113. Well, I could actually only come up with, I think, 105 here, and AB tells me that, I think he's right. There was a couple of Australians in the London bombings of 7/7, which, of course, were perpetrated by the state. Is there anybody here who doesn't believe that? Okay? Because the simple piece of evidence, one of the trains that exploded actually left King's Cross Station before the train that the bombers were allegedly on got into King's Cross. There's actually more empirical evidence to show that these 4 lads were set up. It was an exercise. They were set up. The first bomb went off. They realised that they were the patsies. They were the fall guys. And so they went to Canary Wharf in London, which is where the newspapers are headquartered, and they hoped to try and get to safety. But they were assassinated by British security forces at Canary Wharf. And there is more empirical evidence to support that than there is of them actually getting on the tubes. So this is the way the state works, and I'm going to show you David Cameron's response to my observation in just a second. But we've got 113 deaths, and 88 of them were Bali. Anybody here think that Bali was perpetrated by Muslim extremists? No, Bali was all about creating the fear porn to get Australia on board to support the attack on Iraq in 2003. So without Bali, you're looking at barely single figures almost in terms of deaths through terror, yet you're being told to give up your freedoms. Well, same in the UK. The fear porn here is on the front page of the Eye, which is part of the Independent. Islamic State likely to attack the UK. No, they're not. Not unless they're working with the security services. And this is Gatwick Airport. It's absurd. It's absurd. Well, let me show you what David Cameron had to say just a few weeks ago when he went to the UN specifically to talk about the measures that he was looking to implement to try to shut down the ISIS threat.
The root cause of this terrorist threat is a poisonous ideology of Islamist extremism. This is nothing to do with Islam, which is a peaceful religion which inspires countless acts of generosity every day. Islamist extremism, on the other hand, believes in using the most brutal forms of terrorism to force people to accept a warped worldview and to live in a quasi-medieval state. To defeat ISIL and organizations like it, we must defeat this ideology in all its forms. As evidence emerges about the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offenses, it is clear that many of them were initially influenced by preachers who claim not to encourage violence, but whose worldview can be used as a justification for it. We know this worldview, the peddling of lies, that 9/11 was somehow a Jewish plot, or that the 7/7 London attacks were staged. The idea that Muslims are persecuted all over the world as a deliberate act of Western policy. The concept of an inevitable clash of civilizations. We must be clear, to defeat the ideology of extremism, we need to deal with all forms of extremism, not just violent extremism. For governments, there are some obvious ways we can do this. We must ban preachers of hate from coming to our countries. We must prescribe organizations that incite terrorism against people at home and abroad. We must work together to take down illegal online material like the recent videos of ISIL murdering hostages. And we must stop the so-called non-violent extremists from inciting hatred and intolerance in our schools, our universities, and yes, even our prisons. Of course, some will argue that this is not compatible with free speech and intellectual inquiry. But I ask you, would we sit back and allow right-wing extremists, Nazis or Ku Klux Klansmen to recruit on our university campuses? No. So we shouldn't stand by and just allow any form of non-violent extremism.
We shouldn't stand by and allow any form of non-violent extremists. Well, the day after this appeared, a number of people in the UK went to the police station and handed themselves in and said, you need to arrest me, I'm a non-violent extremist. And of course the police said, well, get out of here. It became known as the toothpaste rebellion, because people went in with a toothbrush and toothpaste because they were expected to go to jail. So of course they were thrown out. But that's where we're heading. That's exactly where we're heading. It's why the channel that puts out my 2 shows in the UK, Fracking Nightmare and Humanity versus Insanity, was shut down earlier this year by ATVOD, a government body that has the responsibility. It is the Authority for Television and Video on Demand. And they shut it down by threatening that unless they submitted to regulation, they would have to pay a fine of £250,000. It's censorship. Okay, so I had to put all the stuff up on my YouTube channel, and I've encouraged people to put it up on their YouTube channel so that, because eventually somebody's going to say it needs to come down. Because Google are very susceptible, because all it takes is the tax office to go visit Google and say, now look, we're thinking of doing a very major audit, but maybe we can work something out. There's a few websites and a few videos that we'd like taken down. If you can get those down, then maybe we can delay the audit. So whereas the likes of Google and YouTube were started with altruistic intent, they're now becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. As Mark said, this was a big trigger for a lot of people, because when people started to investigate the events of 9/11, then it became very evident that the physical evidence did not support the official version of events. And this was a significant trigger. And maybe it's deliberately so. Because a friend of mine who's very much into the tarot shared this with me when I picked up the remarkable similarity between the Rider-Waite depiction on the Tower Tarot card, the 16th card in the Major Arcana, and the events of that day. And this is what she said to me. The Tower is a tarot card about war, a war between the structures of lies and the lightning flash of truth. This is a card about anything we believe to be true but later learn is false. This realization usually comes as a shock, hence the violent image. It's quite simply that moment in any story where someone finds out a shocking truth, one that shatters their perceptions and makes them reassess their beliefs. And you know what? This is almost identical to the description of the rituals in the Memphis Mitzrayim Masonic order of the initiations in the 9th to the 11th degrees, the depiction where the apron is of the beheading. So it's all about giving people an opportunity to step in to a new reality. The question is, which reality are you going to step into? The one that the global corporatists want to establish, one of absolute abject control and slavery, or something else? And the reality is that which one we go to is very much in our control. And those are the tools that we have available, and that the globalists use to try and achieve their objectives, are absolutely in our control. And number one is apathy. Apathy. Because these guys believe that by putting the stuff out there and us not reacting to the scripts, to the information that they're putting out there, and we just go, yeah, that's okay, we don't really worry about that. She'll be right, mate. She'll be right. Then they can get on and do whatever the hell they want to do. The next one, they believe, is the most powerful one of all, abdication. Because by definition, abdication means we've got a pretty good idea what's going on, but we deliberately choose to do nothing. Because she'll be right, mate. And the last one is willful ignorance. The absolute willful ignorance. And of course, this is applied by a lot of people. I was on the front line at Gloucester in the anti-fracking camp there. And this is just 2 weeks ago. And I posted a video online of a conversation I had with a police officer who basically said he was just doing his job. He didn't want to be there, but he's just doing his job. Well, that's what a lot of people said at Nuremberg. I was just following orders. I was just doing my job. And the global corporatists rely on people just doing their job. And they've got to just keep doing their job because they've got them so far into debt, the only way these people believe that they can address their debt is to run ever faster on the treadmill. And that's really one of the great pleasures that I have in participating in these events, because, you know, Mark and AB and Greg have got working models that enable people to actually step off this treadmill. The establishment doesn't like it, and obviously they'll try and shut it down. But whilst we have these tools, we have to use them. But more importantly, we've actually got to participate. You know, I stayed with my good friend Max Egan for a couple of days this week, and I was explaining to Max about my experiences at Gloucester. And he said, you know, well, mate, he said, you're in Apothralia. Apothralia. You know, he said, I thought this fracking agenda, this coal seam gas agenda would bring Australia together, but no one gives a shit. You know, later this week, I'm going out into the gaslands of Queensland because, you know, this state is totally screwed. You know, in the last 3 years, an area the size of the UK, now Queensland is 7 times the size of the UK. But the population density of Queensland, of course, is a lot less. It's 1/100th of the population of the UK. But there's an area the size of the UK that has had nearly 5,000 wells drilled on it in the last 4 years. If that happens in the UK will cease to exist. You know, this is a spring-fed country. This is a country that relies on the ancient water resources. The Great Artesian Basin is being sucked dry at a rate 6 times greater than it can naturally replenish, primarily by the CSG industry. You know, the people with the farms out to the west of Toowoomba, up in Dalby and Tara, their lives have been destroyed. Their livelihoods have been destroyed. The aquifers are filling with gas. The gas is coming out with their water. They can't use the water for livestock, they can't grow crops, and they certainly can't use it for any domestic uses. The vulnerable are getting sick, particularly young children and the elderly and pregnant women. You know, and if we look at what's happening everywhere where this industry has got its bits in the ground, whether it's the US, Canada, and now here in Australia, it's left a trail of devastation behind it. And why? Because in every case, the population doesn't give a damn. It just says, no, it's not affecting me right now. It's not affecting me. Yet where they're fracking right now, they're fracking in the coal seam gas areas, and much of the area that they're fracking is part of the replenishment zone to the Great Artesian Basin. Yeah, this is just one example, but it's a very significant example, because if we don't do something across the world, not just here in Australia, but across the world, then, you know, this fundamental of life, fresh water, is going to become a commodity. In fact, if you look at the financial pages and many of the global press right now, it's talking about water being the new oil. What are we going to do about it? Well, the choice is ours. We can do nothing, and it doesn't have to be coal seam gas. There's so many issues, you know, as Mark addressed, and I'm sure you're going to be hearing more about these as we go through the weekend. But no one of us can pick up on every issue, but pick up on one. Because collectively, we are enormously powerful. Individually, we might not necessarily be able to achieve very much, but collectively, we are scaring the crap out of these global corporatists. This is where they're trying to keep everybody, but people are waking up. I know it sounds perverse, but consider the possibility that they're actually doing us a massive favor. You know, because without darkness, we have no appreciation of what light really is. So just consider the possibility, because without the events of 9/11, of Bali, of the London bombings, of the GFC, we might still all be totally ignorant of what's going on around us. But with the awareness comes a responsibility. And it's a responsibility to try and bring about the change. You know, we're looking at being integrated into a mainframe. And tomorrow I'll show you how rapidly this is occurring, because and how far back this agenda goes. I'll show you that everything that's occurring right now was actually scripted in the 1930s. The only thing they didn't have in the 1930s was the technology. We can all make the decisions. We don't have to do it all at once. We don't need the revolution necessarily. We just need to continually find ways to step off that treadmill, maybe one step at a time. Because it is time to make a call. You know, it's not enough to say, I'm just doing my job. It's not acceptable anymore. You know, and to paraphrase George W. Bush, you're either with us or you're with the socio-psychopathic global corporatists. The choice is very much ours. Thank you very much.
Ian's obviously very passionate about the CSG issue. So if you haven't seen a movie, there's a great movie called Gaslands. It's about what's going on with CSG in the US, and it's quite disturbing. Who finds a nice irony in the fact that we're in the exact same venue as the G20 was last weekend? H20, Harmony 20, yes. This is where Joe Hockey was last week, and all the other Muppet puppets blowing wind up each other's asses. Ian talked about GDP and our debt in relation to GDP. There's a nation called Bhutan, which is near Nepal, and they don't measure GDP. Do you know what they measure? Gross domestic happiness. You guys know it all. I can go home. I just wanted to raise two here that, you know, when the economy crashes, and it's going to happen, it's a cycle, and it's designed to do so. What was interesting, though, was that in the Great Depression of 29 and in the early 30s, people were starving to death. Why were they starving to death? The world still produced the same amount of food. It was monetary. So I'm sorry, but I think there's some evil behind that. Look at some of the terms that are being used by Barack Obama and so forth at the moment. The debt ceiling. The debt ceiling keeps lifting. They keep lifting it through the Congress. And the fiscal cliff. Where are we heading? All right. Ian talks about 7-star hotels. When I was growing up, there was 5-star hotels. Then they went to 6-star. Now there's 7-star hotels in Dubai. Can I tell you where the best 5 trillion star hotel is? It's called camping. Go fucking camping and light a fire and talk to your family. I want to introduce you now to...